Welcome back, folks, to another session in our series in the New Testament letter to the Hebrews. In our session today, we continue with Hebrews chapter 11, verses 20 to 29. We are studying examples of faith in Hebrews 11. This faith that is spoken of here in the Greek is pistis or pisteo, and it is a gift from God at salvation. Thinking of the verse in Ephesians 2 verse 8, for by grace are you saved through faith. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. There we see that faith that we're speaking of, a gift from God at salvation. This faith is defined in Hebrews 11 verses 1, verse 3, and verse 6 as of things hoped for, the assurance of things not seen with the physical eyes, the conviction. This faith brings understanding of truth and of reality, and is the only way to please God or to be approved by God. This faith is rooted in God, His Word, and in His promised one, Messiah Jesus. The Jewish men of old, spoken of here in Hebrews 11, in the Old Testament times, those who had this faith in the promised one and therefore were righteous before God, demonstrated this faith through their actions. Have you noticed that certain men have been given more time in this chapter than others? Well, it is not because they were better, but because of the important role they played. Abraham, who we studied in the last session, Hebrews 11, verse 8 to 19, was the father of the Jewish nation. It is with Abraham that the Lord made a foundational covenant in Genesis 12, verses 1 to 3, which was not only foundational for Israel, but also for God's blessing to the Gentiles, Genesis 12, verse 3, and to all of Scripture. At the center of this covenant is Messiah Jesus, the promised one. This covenant provides for his first and second advents. Abraham was also set apart by God as the Old Testament example of faith. We read of that in Romans chapter 4. The other person given prominence in this chapter is Moses, who we will look at in verses 23 to 29 of chapter 11. It was Moses who was chosen by the Lord to deliver and lead Israel out of Egypt through the wilderness and to the east side of the Jordan River. It was Moses that received the law at Mount Horeb and was set apart as an Old Testament type of Christ, the deliverer. Hebrews 11, verse 20 to 29 takes us from the time of Isaac to the Exodus. Now, the first two men listed here in verse 20 and 21 had some similarities in their experiences. Both men were physically old and blind when they, by this faith, passed on the promised blessing given to their father Abraham in Genesis 12, verse 1 to 3. In both cases, we see God's sovereign election overruling in the passing on of this blessing. Isaac, first of all, was Abraham's son, who was married to Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban, the Aramean. And we see that in Genesis 25, verse 20. Rebekah came from Abram's family in Ur of the Chaldees. Rebekah was the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Nahor, who was the brother of Abraham. We see that in Genesis 11, verse 27 to 29, and chapter 24, verse 47. Isaac, it says, prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife, who was barren. And the Lord graciously and sovereignly answered and allowed her to conceive. They had twins. The Lord explained to Rebekah that what was happening in her womb. There was a lot of turmoil and struggle in her womb. And he explained his sovereign plans for the boys in chapter 25, verse 23 of Genesis. These brothers would be fathers of two nations. The one would be stronger than the other, and the older would serve the younger. Now Isaac knew from that time onward that the blessing would pass on through the youngest twin, Jacob. And Jacob came out of the birth canal after his brother, holding on to the heel of his brother. The word Jacob means one who takes by the heel, and this name aptly describes very well the first part of his life. As the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a peaceful man living in tents. Tensions grew in the family as Esau, the firstborn, became Isaac's favorite son, and Jacob, the younger, became Rebekah's favorite son. You kind of wonder why this was so. Quite possibly, it seems Rebekah was holding fast to God's promise for Jacob to inherit the blessing, whereas Isaac was still hanging on to the tradition of the firstborn. Things became clear as time went on that Esau was not a man of faith, but Jacob was. One day when Esau was coming in from the field, he was famished, and Jacob had cooked a stew, and Esau wanted it. Jacob took the opportunity to make a deal with Esau. First, sell me your birthright. And Esau said, what good is that? I'm starving to death. So Esau sold his birthright for a bowl of stew. Questions arise here. Why would Jacob try to work this out on his own? After all, the Lord had promised Rebekah, his mother, that Jacob would receive the blessing. The Lord had said that the older would serve the younger, and that therefore through the younger the blessing would come. Was Jacob struggling a little bit, perhaps with the way his father Isaac was thinking, and maybe by getting his brother to sell him his birthright, he would make sure that the blessing came through him? Those are some questions to consider. In any case, we see that Jacob recognized value. He recognized what was good. He was a man of faith, but sadly he slipped so often into trying to get it in his own effort. This reminds us of Moses, who sometime later believed God was going to use him to deliver Israel from Egypt. And when he saw a taskmaster beating a Jewish man, he took matters into his own hands and killed the taskmaster. Exodus 2, verse 11 to 14, and Acts 7, verse 23 to 25. Moses would need to flee from Egypt to Midian while God worked in his life, preparing him to serve. And Jacob would also end up fleeing for a time. Genesis 28. In Genesis 27, we read that it came time for Isaac to die. He was old and blind, but before he died, he sent his firstborn son Esau out to hunt some wildlife and make him a savory dish that he so enjoyed before he would bless Esau. Although Isaac was a man of faith, believing God for the promise, he sought to ignore the words of God to Rebekah, forget Esau's bartered birthright, and Esau's grievous lifestyle, the women that he married, and he sought to keep with the tradition of the firstborn. But once again, Jacob, under the guidance of Rebekah, seeing the value of the blessing, sought to obtain it by deception. They sought to make sure the blessing came through Jacob. We'll give God a hand, so to speak. Isaac, blind and deceived, blessed Jacob. Esau came in from the fields shortly after and cooked a savory dish for his father, only to find out that his younger brother had received the blessing. The account shows us that Esau cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry and asked his father to bless him. The sad plea of Esau, seen in chapter 27, verse 38 of Genesis, was, "Do you have only one blessing, my father?" Esau's lot was to be away from the fertility of the earth and from the dew of heaven. He would live by his sword and would serve his brother Jacob, but eventually break his yoke from his neck. This account presents a question. Hebrews calls Isaac a man of faith who blessed Jacob and Esau. Was Isaac really exhibiting faith? Although opposing God's will over the years, Isaac was shaken very deeply when he realized what had happened, that he'd been deceived and had actually blessed Jacob. And he trembled exceedingly. He then emphatically affirmed its validity to Esau in Genesis 27, verse 37 and 40. Yes, men of faith do stumble, but as God deals with them, like Moses and Jacob and Isaac, they recognize their errors. God in his sovereign grace worked out his plans. The second man of faith is Jacob. As he was dying, he blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshiped, leaning on the top of his staff. We have already seen some of Jacob's background as we looked at Isaac. Jacob would go through some rough waters as God dealt with him through his uncle Laban, who deceived him 10 times. We read of that in Genesis 31, verse 38 to 42. And through his encounter with Esau, Genesis 32 and 33. Jacob had 4 wives and 12 boys and a girl by these women. When Jacob returned to the promised land with his family, he would again experience other hardships through them. One of the greatest hardship was the brothers' selling of their brother Joseph into slavery in Egypt, and then deceiving their father with the story that Joseph had been killed by a wild animal. Joseph, in the meantime, went through trials of his own in the land of Egypt before becoming prime minister of the world power Egypt. The Lord used Joseph to prepare for 7 years of famine by harvesting and storing up grain through 7 years of abundance until there was so much he stopped measuring it. At the time of the 7-year famine, Jacob sent his sons to buy grain in Egypt, and they met Joseph. The account of God's dealings with the brothers through Joseph, and then bringing Jacob and his family to settle in Goshen in the land of Egypt, is seen in Genesis 37 to 47. The Lord had declared to Abraham in Genesis 15, verse 13 to 16, that the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would spend time in Egypt before returning to the promised land. In Genesis 48, we have the account of elderly Jacob, whose eyes were dim, blessing the 2 sons of Joseph. Why would he bless Joseph's sons? Reuben was the firstborn. Because of Reuben's sin of sleeping with his father's concubine, Bilhah. We read of that in Genesis 35, verse 22. Joseph received the position of firstborn within the family, and with this came the double blessing. Reuben was the firstborn of Jacob's first wife, Leah. Joseph was the firstborn of Jacob's second wife, Rachel. Jacob was going to bless the 2 sons of Joseph, Manasseh and Ephraim. We read in Genesis 48. They would become tribes in Israel. This was the double blessing. Once again, God sovereignly changed the order. Joseph brought his sons before Jacob, expecting Manasseh, the firstborn, to receive the blessing of the firstborn. But Jacob crossed his hands, putting Ephraim before Manasseh. Jacob, it says, worshipped on his staff, ready to move on to the city whose architect and builder is God. Now, Hebrews 11, verse 22 continues and lists the third person in this hall of faith, Joseph. God sovereignly led Joseph through the experiences of being sold into slavery, serving in Potiphar's house, being imprisoned by the false accusations of Potiphar's sleazy wife, meeting Pharaoh's butler and baker in the prison, being used by God to interpret their dreams, arriving before the Pharaoh to interpret his dream, and being placed as prime minister of the superpower of Egypt in order to prepare Joseph to look after his father and the fledgling nation of Israel during the famine. Genesis 50, verse 20. As Joseph prepared to die, he, by this faith, believing the promises of the Lord, spoke of the exodus of the sons of Israel. And in this faith, Joseph gave orders for his bones to be taken with them. When this time came, Joseph had played his part. Now it was time to go home. But he knew after his death that God would bring Israel out of Egypt into the promised land and settle them in this land. He knew that God would fulfill all his promises to Abraham and to his nation Israel and bring about the coming of the promised one through this nation who would provide redemption. Our fourth person in this passage is Moses. We read in verse 23 to 29 of Hebrews 11. Now Moses, whose name means drawing out, as in drawing out of the water, that comes from the word massa. We read this in Exodus 2, verse 10. This was the name given to Moses by Pharaoh's daughter, referring to her discovery of him as a baby in a basket made from papyrus reeds and hidden among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. The passage in Hebrews 11, verse 23 to 29 is broken into 5 sections of Moses' life, from his birth to the palace, to his flight from Egypt, to his observance of the first Passover, to the crossing of the Red Sea. Each section is introduced by these words, by faith, or by this faith. Let's look at them in that order. Verse 23 of chapter 11, Moses' birth. By this faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. A new king had arisen who did not know Joseph. Exodus 1, verse 8. He was fearful of the great numerical growth among the Israelites and placed them under taskmasters as slaves to Egypt. They were placed in all kinds of labor. They built 2 of Pharaoh's storage cities that are mentioned in Exodus 1, verse 11, Pithom and Ramses. Archaeology has also unearthed Egyptian mines that were worked by Hebrew slaves during the time of slavery. Inscriptions have been found, inscriptions made in ancient Hebrew, in Proto-Sinaitic script. They've been found on the walls of the mines. These inscriptions speak about the God of Israel. But the more that Israel was afflicted, the more they increased in number, which led the king's edict to kill all baby boys who were born. Exodus 1:22. But by this faith, Moses' parents, we see in Exodus 2, hid him for 3 months because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Now, what does it mean, a beautiful child? Every baby is cute. Is that why they hid him? Because he was just a cute baby? Well, the word for beautiful used here speaks of belonging unto God, pleasing in the eyes of God. God had a purpose for this baby, and by this faith, his parents recognized this and hid him, entrusting him to the Lord. In chapter 11, verse 24 to 26, we see the second part of Moses' life. Moses' refusal to remain in the palace. By this faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God, that's with Israel, than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Considering the reproach of Christ, Messiah, greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. Moses rejected the beliefs of Egypt. He rejected the status, the power, and the wealth of Egypt. History has said that Moses could have been one of the greatest pharaohs of that time, but he denied the lures of Egypt, choosing rather to embrace the one true God of Israel and endure persecution with the people of Israel. Moses had this faith rooted in the promised one, Messiah. He saw through the pleasures of sin and all that Egypt offered as passing, a limited time. They were limited and empty. To know the promised Messiah, to be identified with him, and to possess the promises of God were greater riches than Egypt. And he was willing to endure reproach. He was willing to be insulted. Insulting here means causing damage. Moses was looking to the reward. Hebrews 11, verse 6 and verse 10 and 16 also speak of that. Notice, in contrast, the buildings of Egypt to the city of God, which has foundations, to a heavenly country. We see in Hebrews 11, verse 27, that Moses left Egypt. We read, by this faith, Moses left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is unseen. Exodus tells us that after Moses tried to take matters into his own hands and killed the Egyptian taskmaster because he believed that God was going to use him to deliver Israel, that Moses was afraid when he was found out. Pharaoh tried to kill Moses for killing an Egyptian, and Moses fled in fear from the presence of Pharaoh, Exodus 2, verse 14 to 15. But Hebrews 11, verse 27 says, not fearing the wrath of the king, he left Egypt. Now this sounds like a contradiction, but it is not. Moses feared for his life and fled, but he did not fear what the king in the palace thought of him. This agrees with the context of Hebrews 11, verse 24 to 26. Moses wasn't worried about his reputation. In chapter 11, verse 27, it tells us that Moses endured or persevered. He was steadfast and patient, as seeing, and the word seeing speaks of to stare, to be aware, to discern, to perceive him who is unseen. Hebrews 11, verse 1 says that this faith sees what is not seen with a human eye. What was it that caused Moses to endure? Moses perceived with inward spiritual perception the Lord, who is not seen with a physical eye. He saw God's hand in all of this. He saw that God was in complete control. Everything looked like it was falling apart in Moses' life. But he understood that God was working out his plan in this. And he left Egypt for the time being, which would be 40 years of training in Midian. God was going to prepare his servant. Now in Hebrews 11, verse 28, we see he kept the Passover. By this faith, Moses kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, so that he who destroyed the firstborn would not touch them. That's Israel. After 40 years in Midian, learning how to shepherd sheep and meeting God at the burning bush, Moses was ready to return to Egypt and be used by God. In Exodus, we see a Pharaoh who resisted the one true God, seeking to make himself God. That was the Egyptian belief. And we see that God would bring 10 plagues upon Egypt and their false gods to show that he alone was God, that Moses was his servant, that Israel was his people, and that Pharaoh was to let Israel go to serve God. The last plague was the death of the firstborn. Israel was instructed to take a 1-year-old unblemished male lamb for each household, to keep it until the 14th day of the month. Kill it at twilight. Put the blood of the lamb on the doorposts and lintel of the house. Eat the lamb roasted by fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, and in readiness to leave. The scriptures tell us that the Lord passed through the land of Egypt that night and struck all the Egyptian firstborn of man and beast who did not have the blood of the lamb on the doorposts and lintel of their homes. Now, the firstborn of Egypt represented the nation of Egypt. They were under God's judgment. The firstborn of Israel was spared because they had the blood of the lamb on the doorposts and lintel of their homes. Once again, the firstborn of Israel represented the nation of Israel. God called his nation Israel his firstborn, Exodus 4, verse 22 to 23. And Israel was spared because of the blood of the Lamb. What a powerful testimony this was of an even greater event, the substitutional death of the promised one, Jesus Messiah, who died for Israel and all of mankind as our substitute, as our sacrificed lamb. Those who put their trust in him alone are saved from sin and from the wrath of God. Now in verse 29, we see the fifth part of Moses' life as Moses and the nation of Israel passed through the Red Sea. We read, by this faith, they passed through the Red Sea as though they were passing through dry land. And the Egyptians, when they attempted it, were drowned. Pharaoh wanted Israel out of Egypt right after the deaths of the firstborn. Right away, Israel left with much spoil. But after they left, Pharaoh changed his mind and he hardened his heart even more and sent out his chariots for a mass annihilation of Israel. Israel found themselves between the proverbial rock and a hard place. But God was faithful and stood between the Egyptians and his people. The Lord told Moses to stretch his rod out, and God opened the Red Sea, holding back these massive walls of water and drawing a path between the waters from one shore to the other shore. By this faith, Israel passed through to the other side But the Egyptians who saw them go over tried to follow, oblivious to the one true God. The walls of water that offered safe passage to Israel became a massive, crushing force on the Egyptians. Pharaoh's whole army and chariots were drowned at the bottom of the sea. Research teams in the past have located the spot where this happened, a place along the Gulf of Aqaba. Underneath, they have found the remains of Pharaoh's army, chariot wheels encrusted in coral, even some metal chariot wheels which they have been able to photograph. By this faith that's spoken of in Hebrews 11, verse 1, 3, and 6, Moses was hidden. Moses refused to follow the world's enticements. Moses did not worry about his reputation. Moses and Israel kept the first Passover that night in Egypt. And by this faith, Moses and the nation of Israel crossed the Red Sea. The crossing of the Red Sea so aptly follows the Passover. The Passover foreshadowed the suffering of the promised one who suffered in our place, so that all who believe will live. The Red Sea illustrates that those who put their trust in the Passover Lamb of God are baptized into him and free from sin and bondage and alive unto God.